All right, good day everyone. Let us continue on with the central nervous system and look at the motor circuits and emotion. So we'll begin by looking at the voluntary movements that are done and regulated by the basal nuclei. Where the basal nuclei, these are masses of gray matter that are located deep in the white matter of the cerebrum. And so those are these colored structures that we see here. The most prominent of these basal nuclei include the corpus striatum. So the corpus striatum is made up of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. So what we have then are the axons within the cerebral cortex are going to control movement by sending information into the basal nuclei, predominantly here within the putamen. Okay. Also, some smaller regions include these black and gray spots that we see here, which are the subthalamic nucleus of the diencephalon and the substantia nigra of the midbrain. And so if we have degeneration of dopaminergic neurons, which dopaminergic meaning that they release dopamine as their primary neurotransmitter, from the substantia nigra to the corpus callosum, this will cause Parkinson's disease. Okay. So the motor circuit includes information that goes from the frontal lobe, so if we see here, and to then the putamen. Okay. So here what I'm trying to highlight. And so these neurons tend to release glutamate, which is excitatory. The putamen then will release GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, into other regions of the basal nuclei. So if we look at this image here, I want to highlight this legend here. So the green are going to be the glutamate neurotransmitter, and then red here with GABA. So I'm going to do red, how about? So from the putamen to other regions of the basal nuclei, okay, so that we don't become overexcited, because that can cause like twitching, for example. And then the globus pallidus then sends GABA, inhibitory, again, neurotransmitter, to the thalamus, okay, which sends then excitatory axons to the motor cortex of the cerebrum. So then if we go back here, then that information is going to have excitatory information. So it's kind of like this circle of exciting and inhibiting certain responses so that we can devote only a limited amount of energy into exciting the motor neurons that need to be activated. And so this circuit of excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters that are being released is considered to be the motor circuit. And so again, this is important for then having appropriate movements and then inhibiting unwanted movements. Because if we didn't have this, for instance, we'd have like jerky reactions all the time. And so people who have a damaged basal nuclei actually do have that where they can't like voluntarily control what their movements are. So another motor movement that you might not have thought about, but language and speech is involved with the frontal lobe. And so most of the knowledge of how the brain controls language has come from studying people with speech problems called aphasias. And so there's two areas that are identified as important. So the first one is Broca's area. And so here, the motor speech area, or Broca's area. And so this is for controlling motor aspects of speech. This is found though only in the left inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so people with Broca's aphasia then have a slow, poorly articulated speech. However, they can understand speech. Interestingly, other actions of the tongue, lips, and larynx, though, are not affected. Only the production of speech is affected. So they can swallow, no problem whatsoever. The second area, Wernicke's area, which is highlighted here, This controls understanding now of words. So this too is located in the left superior temporal gyrus. And with people who have aphasia of the Wernicke's area, can have production of rapid speech but no meaning. So this is called like a word salad, where language that is written and spoken, comprehension is just completely destroyed. This is important, the Wernicke's area, for controlling understanding of words, and information about written words is sent by the occipital lobe with the visual cortex, as well as by hearing of sounds as well. So again, if this is damaged, then you have a difficulty producing meaningful speech. So then putting it all together for speech, to speak, one must have word comprehension that's going to originate here in Wernicke's area and then send that information to the Broca's area. Okay? And then Broca's area will send information to the motor cortex to direct movement of appropriate muscles that are involved for speech. All right, so now let's get into the limbic system and then into our emotions. So the limbic system is going to form a ring, such as what we see within the green here, that's going to go around the brainstem on both sides of the thalamus, which we have highlighted here. Okay, and so this is the part of the cerebral cortex, too, that's involved with both positive and negative emotions. So some negative emotions include fear and pain. That's why everyone's responses to pain are going to be different. And so let's go through the main structures and their functions for the limbic system. So the amygdala first, what we have here, okay. So this is important for memory formation, and a lot of it has to do with memory of fear responses. So like visual processing of fearful faces, especially like that when we were young. Say if you're scared to death of clowns, then your amygdala has been has created those memories of fear. So amygdala also is responsible for fear and aggression. And so it's going to increase when we're in stressful situations. All of these structures of the brain of the limbic system, though, I want to also point out that they will be responsible for sex drive as well. Okay, so both negative and positive experiences. The next one, so the hypothalamus, what we have here. Okay, so this is important as well for rage and aggression, and is involved in fear, feeding, sex, and then goal directed behavior. And also we'll have for hunger and like a satiety, which is feeling full sensation. All right, then the cingulate gyrus here. This is involved in motivation and is a negative emotion, and as well as with sex. I have it outlined here in this yellow box instead of black because it's not actually connected with the limbic system. Rather, it is part of the cerebral cortex. Okay, the hippocampus. So this is going to form this ring that goes around. Okay, and so this is primarily responsible for memory. And this activity will be decreased by stressful situations. So that's why when you are frantically studying for exam, you're not retaining and remembering a lot of information, not making any new connections with your brain. So one thing to note is that with the amygdala and the hippocampus here, they have receptors for stress hormones and cortisol. So whereas the amygdala, this was increased by stress, hippocampus now is going to be decreased. So the more cortisol you have circulating, the more stress, the less likely you are to form new memories. All right, the septal nucleus, which we have right here. This is responsible for the pleasure responses that we see, like those euphoric sensations. And lastly, the thalamus, which is going to be this whole region here. This is important for memory processing, also is a relay station for our different senses. Now, the interesting thing about the limbic system is that there's very few connections with the cerebral cortex here. And so that's why it might be hard to actually control your emotions, because it kind of acts as its own system within the brain and in terms of functioning as well. So the Papez circuit is what has been described by a physiologist called Papez, and how those few synaptic connections do integrate with our cerebral cortex between the limbic and system as well. So when we have some type of emotional stimulus, this is going to activate first our thalamus. The thalamus then is going to send impulses to the sensory cortex as well as to the hypothalamus, and primarily within the mammillary bodies. Okay, so then we'll have activation of the cingulate gyrus of the limbic system, and then we'll start to activate then the hippocampus. Okay, so then from the hippocampus, they'll start to activate hypothalamus to then send out different hormones, and then from there we'll have some type of bodily response. And so when we have the hippocampus, which again was involved primarily of learning and memories, this is when that whole circuit is going to be complete, when this is activated here. Now, another example of how we have the integration between the limbic system and emotions and our cerebral cortex, predominantly with the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe, we have where emotions are going to strengthen or weaken memory formation. And so a lot of this will have to do with cortisone, okay, so our stress hormone. And so stress, again, no surprise, is going to impair memory consolidation within the hippocampus. And so it's going to then decrease the amount of memory function on the prefrontal cortex. Cortex. For instance, people with post-traumatic stress disorder have a decrease in the hippocampus where that region actually starts to die off. So there's an interesting story that came out maybe a year or two ago now on people who had been with 9/11, who had been at World Trade Center, and those individuals that had started exercising right away, not like full-on marathon run or anything, but just literally walking around and talking to somebody about the experience and what had just happened, actually had a decrease in post-traumatic stress symptoms, as well as a decrease in the amount of death of their hippocampal neurons, as compared to individuals who were there at the same time, but who just sat there and were just paralyzed, from the mental drain that it took. So the interesting thing is, so there are mechanisms such as exercise that can help to reverse these negative effects that we see with something like post-traumatic stress disorder. So, though the last thing with this is that memories, we do have them that are stored. However, the problem and normally just as we age, is the retrieval is hindered. So once you do have that memory formed, it's just a matter of can you retrieve it and how quickly can you retrieve it. Typically, young individuals are able to retrieve information a lot faster than older individuals. However, a lot of times just the elderly tend to get more upset about it. And it's not that their memories are usually that bad as they think. All right, so two areas though I do want to talk about that are involved. So we have the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex, and so that's here in the blue. And then also we have the lateral prefrontal area. Okay, so this first one, the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex, that is a mouthful, I know. This is where we have conscious experience of pleasure and reward, and so this receives all input and senses from the limbic system. And so if somebody had this damage, this would be like very impulsive behavior, almost to the point of a sociopath. Now, lateral prefrontal area here in the purple again, this is responsible for motivation and sex desire and cognitive function. So if somebody, say, had this impaired, then say they would have a lack of motivation, like apathetic, a low sex drive, and then very slow in terms of their cognitive function as well.